All right. Today we're diving deep into something I know you guys deal with every day as environmental health officers,
Oh, yeah.
NOx pollution. But we're going way beyond just the basics here.
Okay.
We'll be breaking down not only what NOx is and why it's a big deal for public health,
All right.
but also how you actually collect that data using diffusion tubes,
Okay. Yeah.
and then what those numbers actually tell us.
Interesting. It is interesting because even with everyone talking about air quality these days,
Uh-huh.
there are still some surprising things about NOx that a lot of people don't realize,
Yeah.
especially when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of how we actually measure it
Right.
out there in the real world.
Exactly. So first things first,
Yeah.
just in case anybody listening needs a little refresher,
Yeah.
what exactly is NOx?
So NOx is basically just shorthand for nitrogen oxides.
Okay.
Which is a whole family of gases. The two main ones you deal with are nitrogen dioxide, NO2,
Okay.
and then nitric oxide, NO. And these gases, they're a byproduct of combustion. So think vehicle engines, industrial processes, even like your boiler at home.
Oh, wow.
All those things are adding to the NOx levels in the air.
And it's not just an aesthetic problem, right? This is like
No.
real health effects we're talking about.
Absolutely. Real measurable health effects. NOx can trigger inflammation in your airways, which can then make people more susceptible to respiratory infections. Think like bronchitis.
Okay.
Studies have even linked long-term exposure to NO2
Doug?
to increased mortality rates,
Wow.
even after you factor in other pollutants.
That's a great point.
And that's really where your work comes in as EHOS.
Right.
You're not just looking at numbers. You're gathering evidence that can directly impact public health decisions and policies.
Yeah, and sometimes I think we forget about the humans
Yeah.
behind all the data.
It's easy to do.
Before we get into how councils actually monitor this NOx, can you talk a little bit more about those specific exposure risks?
Sure. So high concentrations of NO2, like anything above 200 micrograms per cubic meter,
Okay.
that can be a real immediate threat to health, even in the short term.
Wow.
But it is hard to isolate the effects of just NO2
I bet.
because it's often released alongside other pollutants, like particulate matter. It's kind of like, imagine baking a cake
Okay, yeah.
and then trying to separate out the ingredients after it's already baked.
Right. It's all mixed
Crispy
together.
straight. Yeah.
So how do UK councils go about measuring these NOx levels?
Right.
I know diffusion tubes are a key tool here,
Yes.
but can you break down for us how they actually work?
Yeah, so picture a diffusion tube. It's like a little cylinder
Okay.
that just sits there and passively absorbs NO2 from the air over a period of time.
Okay.
Usually it's like a month. It's really simple and cost-effective, which is why they're so widely used.
Right. It makes sense.
Now, these are considered an indicative technique.
Okay.
They're not the gold standard.
Gotcha.
We have automatic analyzers for that. Those give you continuous real-time data.
Fancy.
But diffusion tubes still play a really important role in helping us understand the bigger picture of NOx levels across an area.
So I'm curious about the placement of these tubes. Does the location play a big role in how accurate those readings are?
Absolutely. Picking the right spot for your diffusion tube is critical.
Okay.
You have to consider what kind of environment you're trying to monitor.
Right.
So, for example, if you want curbside levels, the tube should be within 1 meter of the curb.
Okay.
But if you're monitoring a roadside location, then it should be further back, maybe like 1 to 5 meters away from the curb edge.
So there's a science to it.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just sticking it wherever.
No. And the main principle is making sure that the tube is exposed to freely flowing air.
I see.
Because wind patterns and air circulation can really affect how the NO2 is absorbed.
Right. So the wind, I can already tell this is going to get interesting.
Yeah.
How does wind actually affect the performance of the diffusion tube?
So wind can actually disrupt the normal diffusion process.
Okay.
Diffusion tubes, they kind of rely on the steady, predictable flow of air across their opening.
Right.
But strong winds can create turbulence.
Ah, okay.
And that can essentially shorten the effective length of the tube. And that can lead to lower readings than what the actual NO2 concentration is.
So we've got this wind issue that could be messing with our results.
Yeah.
Have there been any attempts to try to address this and make those diffusion tubes less susceptible?
Yeah, there have actually. Researchers have tried things like using membranes or meshes
Okay.
to create like a more controlled airflow around that opening.
Oh, okay.
But these solutions, they tend to introduce new complexities.
Oh, no.
So for instance, figuring out the uptake rates with membranes, that would mean you'd need more data points,
Like what?
like wind speed, temperature, humidity, and those aren't always readily available at every monitoring location.
Right.
So it's kind of this trade-off. You're trying to improve accuracy in one area,
Yeah.
but then you create new challenges somewhere else.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, it sounds like.
It is.
So knowing all these limitations, what are the key takeaways for EHOs who are out there using these diffusion tubes?
I think the most important thing is to just be aware of the limitations
Okay.
and factor those into how you interpret the data.
Okay.
So understanding how things like wind and placement can affect your readings, that's really important for making those informed decisions.
Makes sense.
And remember, diffusion tubes are just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Combine that data with information from other sources like traffic patterns, industrial activity, even weather data.
Wow.
All of that can help you paint a more complete picture.
Okay, so we're using our knowledge of the local environment, other data,
Yeah.
to contextualize and get a more accurate understanding of the NOx. So now we've gathered all this data. What do we do with it?
Right.
How is it actually used to make the air better and protect public health?
Well, that's where the real impact of your work comes in. The NOx data, from those diffusion tubes, that informs a whole range of actions and policies that aim to reduce air pollution.
Okay.
Like, for example, the data can help you identify NOx hotspots.
Right.
So those are the areas with particularly high levels.
Right.
And then you can use that information to make decisions about things like traffic management, zoning regulations,
Oh, wow.
even placement of new infrastructure.
To try to minimize that exposure.
Exactly.
So it's shaping the environment we're living in.
It really is.
Can you give me a specific example of how this data might be used in the real world?
Sure. Let's say you've been monitoring NOx levels in a residential area near a busy road using diffusion tubes.
Okay.
And you start to notice there's this consistent trend of elevated NO2. Combine that data with things like traffic flow analysis, maybe even health data from local clinics. That could be strong evidence to support something like implementing a low-emission zone.
So the data from these tiny little tubes is basically translated into action.
Exactly.
I'm wondering, though, are there any specific techniques or strategies that EHOs can use to make sure that they're getting the most reliable data possible,
Right.
even with the limitations?
There are a few things that can help. First, think about using multiple tubes at a single location.
Okay.
That can help account for any variability in wind patterns
Okay.
or other localized factors
Right.
and give you a more robust average reading.
It's kind of like getting a second opinion, right?
Exactly.
But I imagine using more tubes also means more money.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You're always balancing accuracy with budget constraints,
Yeah.
and that's where those bias adjustment factors come in.
What are those?
They're basically statistical calculations that help account for that variability in diffusion tube measurements. They help give you a more accurate estimate of the real NOx concentration.
Okay.
So, like, if you know that wind conditions at a site tend to underestimate NO2 levels by, say, 10%,
Right.
you can apply a bias adjustment factor to make up for that.
So we're fine-tuning the data based on what we know about the environment and the limits of the technology.
Exactly.
Are there any other strategies?
Yeah, another technique is called a co-location study.
What's that?
That's where you put diffusion tubes alongside an automatic analyzer.
Oh, okay.
That's like the gold standard.
Fancy.
By comparing readings from both at the same location,
Okay.
you can really see how accurate your diffusion tubes are,
Gotcha.
and then you can make any adjustments you need to...
To how you interpret the data.
Exactly.
So we're calibrating those tubes against the more precise measurement tool.
Precisely.
And of course, the lab work is crucial too.
Oh, absolutely.
Proper calibration of the equipment, the standardized solutions, all that quality control.
Yeah, that's all essential for good data.
So from where we put them to how we analyze them, it's a whole process.
It is.
It really does require an understanding of the science and all the practical stuff.
Absolutely.
This deep dive's really given me a new appreciation for the complexity of it all.
Yeah.
And how crucial EHOs are in making sure that the data we're collecting and how we're interpreting it is actually accurate.
It's a big responsibility.
It is. And what's so cool is that this technical work leads to real actions that can actually improve the air and protect public health.
It's really rewarding work.
I bet.
You're making a real difference.
Given how widespread these NOx emissions are, Are there any areas where EOs might be facing particularly challenging situations or things they need to consider?
You know, one area that often comes up is around schools and other sensitive locations.
All right.
Kids are especially vulnerable to air pollution, so monitoring and then mitigating those NOx levels in those areas is extra important.
Right, yeah.
You might need to add more monitoring points.
Okay.
Or maybe adjust how you interpret the data.
Yeah.
Just based on the needs of that location.
It's like every environment needs a specific approach.
It really does. And as technology's changing, we're also seeing new monitoring tools and techniques popping up.
Like what?
Things like low-cost sensors, mobile monitoring platforms.
Oh, cool.
They're becoming more available.
That's awesome.
And that gives us new possibilities for collecting and analyzing data.
It sounds like a lot to keep up with.
It is. Staying informed about those advancements, understanding how they work with traditional methods, that's going to be essential for EHOS moving forward.
So this field is constantly evolving.
It is.
What advice would you give to EHOs who want to stay ahead of the curve and use the best methods?
I'd say continuous learning is key. Engage with those professional organizations. Attend workshops. Read the latest research.
Right.
Networking with other EOs is really valuable too. Share those experiences and knowledge.
It's like a community.
It is. And don't be afraid to try out new technologies, new approaches, but always keep in mind the specific needs of your community and the environment you're monitoring.
This has been a true masterclass in NOx monitoring for EOs.
I hope it's been helpful.
We've covered so much: the fundamentals of NOx, the health impacts, those intricate details of diffusion tubes, data interpretation, the bigger picture of air quality management.
It's all connected.
I think the most important takeaway is that EOs are on the front lines.
Yes, you are.
You're protecting public health.
Yeah.
And all that work you do, often behind the scenes, has a lasting impact.
It really does.
On the well-being of your communities.
Couldn't have said it better myself. You guys bridge the gap between the science and the action. You're turning data into positive change. Keep asking those questions, keep pushing for innovation, and keep fighting for clean air for everybody. Your work is making a difference.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the world of NOx and diffusion tubes.
Great talking to you.
Thanks for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me. It was all about getting that good exposure for the tube to make sure we get a really good sample of the air.
Yeah.
But of course, you know, diffusion tubes aren't perfect.
Right.
They've got their little quirks.
I bet.
And one of the biggest things that can affect readings is the wind.
The wind. I knew it.
Yeah.
So how does the wind actually mess with the diffusion tube? Like, how does that work?
So the wind can actually disrupt the whole diffusion process.
Right.
So inside the tube.
Yeah.
It relies on that steady flow of air across the opening.
Right.
But if you have really strong winds, it can create turbulence.
Oh.
And that can basically make the tube shorter.
Right.
Like the effective length of the tube gets shorter, which can lead to lower readings than what the actual NO2 concentration is.
So the wind could be making our numbers look better
Potentially.
than they really are.
Yeah.
So have people trying to fix this?
Yeah.
Like make the tubes less sensitive to the wind?
Yeah, they have.
What have they tried?
Like using membranes or meshes
Okay.
to create a more controlled airflow around the opening.
That makes sense.
But a lot of times those solutions create other problems.
Oh, no.
Like, say you want to calculate those uptake rates with the membranes, you need even more data.
What kind of data?
Things like wind speed, temperature, humidity, and that's not always easy to get at every spot you're monitoring.
So you fix one problem and create another one.
Yeah, exactly.
So for the EHOs out there, using these tubes, knowing about these limitations, what should they keep in mind?
Well, the most important thing is just to be aware of those limitations and then think about them when you're looking at the data.
Okay.
So understanding how things like wind, placement, all of that can affect your readings. That's super important.
Makes sense.
To make good decisions.
Yeah.
And remember, this is just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
Combine it with other info.
Like what?
Traffic patterns,
Okay.
industrial activity, even weather data.
Oh, wow.
That can really help give you that complete picture.
So we're using what we know about the area to get a more accurate understanding of what's going on.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've collected all this data. Now what? What do we do with it?
That's where your work has a real impact.
Okay.
That NOx data from the tubes
Yeah.
informs so many different actions and policies aimed at reducing that air pollution.
That's amazing.
Like, for example, you can pinpoint those NOx hotspots.
Okay.
The areas with the highest levels.
Right.
And then you can use that info to make choices about traffic.
Okay.
Zoning.
Oh, wow.
Even where to put new buildings and stuff.
To reduce that exposure.
Exactly.
It's like we're literally shaping the environment.
We really are.
That's wild. Do you have like a real world example of this?
Sure.
Like how this data might be used?
Let's say you've been keeping an eye on NOx in a neighborhood near a busy road using the tubes.
Yeah.
And you're seeing high NO2 levels.
Consistently high.
Yeah, pretty consistently.
Okay.
Combine that data with traffic info, maybe even health records from local clinics.
Right.
And you might have a good reason to make it a low emission zone.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So the data from these little tubes.
It's pretty cool, right?
It is. It's like translating that data into action.
Exactly.
I'm wondering, though, are there specific things EHOs can do to make sure they're getting the most reliable data from the tubes?
Yeah, there are a few strategies. First, think about using more than one tube at each location to account for wind and stuff.
Oh, right. Yeah.
To give you a better average.
Like getting a second opinion.
Exactly.
But more tubes means more money. Right.
I got it.
So it's that balance again.
There it is.
Accuracy versus budget.
Yep.
So what are those bias adjustment factors you mentioned?
They're just calculations.
Okay.
To account for the differences in tube readings.
Okay.
They can give you a more accurate number.
Of the NOx concentration.
Exactly.
So for example, if you know that wind at a particular site tends to give you a lower reading by, say, 10%.
Okay.
You can adjust for that.
So we're fine-tuning the data.
Yep.
Based on what we know about the environment and how the tech works.
Exactly.
Are there any other tricks?
Another technique is called a co-location study.
What's up? You put a tube right next to an automatic analyzer, which is like the best way to measure.
Right, the gold standard.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you compare the two.
At the same place.
Yep.
Okay.
And that tells you how accurate your tube is.
So it's like double checking against something more accurate.
Precisely.
And then, of course, we have the lab work.
Oh, yeah, that's key.
Making sure the equipment's calibrated.
Absolutely.
All those standard solutions.
Yes.
The quality control.
It's essential.
So from picking the right spot to analyzing everything.
It's a whole process.
A multifaceted process.
I like that.
It really requires understanding the science and the practical side of things.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has really made me appreciate how complex this is.
Yeah.
And how important it is for EHOs.
Yeah.
To make sure we're collecting and interpreting the data in the right way.
It's a big responsibility.
It is. And what's so cool is all this technical stuff actually helps protect public health.
It really is rewarding.
It must be.
Yeah, it is.
So given how common NOx is, are there any areas where EHOs might have extra challenges?
Schools and other places where there are lots of kids.
Right.
Kids are just more sensitive
Makes sense.
to air pollution. So monitoring and mitigating NOx there is super important.
Definitely.
You might need to use more monitoring points. Or adjust how you're interpreting the data based on that specific location.
It's like every place needs a unique approach.
It does.
We can't just use one solution everywhere.
Right. And as technology is always changing, we're seeing new monitoring tools popping up.
Like what kind of tools?
Things like low-cost sensors, mobile monitoring platforms.
Oh, that's neat.
They're becoming more and more common.
It's cool to see the field growing like that.
It is. EHOs will need to stay informed about these advancements and learn how they work with the traditional methods.
To stay ahead of the curve. So any advice for EHOs who want to stay up to date?
Continuous learning is so important.
Right.
Join professional groups. Go to workshops. Read up on the latest research.
Makes sense.
Connect with other EHOs.
Right.
Share what, you know.
Yeah, like a community.
Yeah. And don't be scared to try new things. But always keep in mind the needs of your community and the environment you're monitoring.
This has been a masterclass in NOx monitoring.
I hope it's been helpful.
We've covered so much.
We have.
The basics of NOx, the health impacts, the ins and outs of diffusion tubes, data analysis, the big picture of air quality.
It's all connected.
I think the key takeaway here is that EHOs are really important.
You guys are on the front lines.
Yeah.
You're protecting public health.
It's true. A lot of the work we do
Yeah.
happens behind the scenes,
Uh,
but it has a huge impact
it does.
on our communities.
Absolutely. You're bridging the gap between the science and actually taking action. You take the data and you make positive changes.
It's rewarding work.
It is. Keep asking questions. Keep innovating.
Yeah.
Keep fighting for clean air for all.
That's a great message.
Your work is making a real difference.
On that inspiring note,
Yeah.
we're going to wrap up this deep dive into NOx and diffusion tubes.
It's been great talking to you.
Thanks for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me. It really is. It's amazing how something as simple as like measuring NO2 with these little tubes can actually have such a big impact on, people's health.
That's what I found so interesting about this whole conversation.
Yeah.
We always think of air pollution as this kind of like vague concept.
Right.
But when you actually see how the data's collected and analyzed and then how it's used to make real decisions, it suddenly becomes a lot more real.
Yeah, it does.
And it highlights how important EHOs are in like connecting the science to actually helping people.
Yeah, you're the ones translating those numbers into meaningful action.
And I think as you continue this work with NOx monitoring, you're going to come across even more complexities.
Oh, for sure.
Especially with something like NO2 that's everywhere.
It's ubiquitous.
Yeah, exactly. So are there any areas where EHOs might find themselves facing, like, especially tough situations?
One area that's always tricky is around schools and other places with lots of kids.
Right.
Because they're just so much more vulnerable
Makes sense.
to air pollution. So monitoring and mitigating NOx levels in those areas, that's just so critical.
Right.
You might even need to have, like, extra monitoring spots or, think differently about how you're looking at the data.
Yeah, tailor it.
Exactly, based on the needs of that specific spot.
It's like you can't use the same approach everywhere.
You can't, no.
No.
And, technology is always changing. So we're seeing all these new tools and techniques coming out.
Like what?
Things like low-cost sensors,
Okay.
mobile monitoring platforms.
Nope.
Those are becoming more readily available.
That's great.
Which gives us even more ways to collect and analyze the data.
It sounds like there's a lot to stay on top of.
There is. It's important for eHouse to stay informed about all these changes.
Right.
To make sure they're using the best methods.
So the field's constantly evolving.
It really is.
What advice would you give to eHouse who want to stay ahead of the curve?
I'd say never stop learning.
Okay.
Get involved with those professional organizations, attend workshops, read the latest research, network with other EHOs, share what you know.
Right. Build that community.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment with new technologies, new approaches.
But always remembering
Of course.
the specific needs of your community.
Absolutely.
And the environment that you're monitoring.
It's all about context.
Well, this has been amazing.
Oh, good. I'm glad
A true masterclass in NOx monitoring for EHOs.
Well, thank you.
We've covered it all.
We have, from NOx basics to health impacts, all the details of those diffusion tubes,
Right.
how to interpret the data.
The big picture of air quality management.
It's a big job you guys have.
It is. But I think what we've really highlighted here is the importance of the work that EHOs do.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're on the front lines.
You are.
Protecting public health.
That's right.
And the work, even when it's behind the scenes, has a real lasting impact.
It really does.
On people's lives.
You're bridging the gap between the science and the action.
Yeah.
Taking the data and turning it into positive change for people.
It's really inspiring.
It is. Keep asking questions, keep innovating.
Yeah.
Keep fighting for clean air for everyone.
Well said. On that inspiring note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the world of NOx and diffusion tubes. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.